So we went through a lot of things on exception handling. Different kinds of exceptions and how to handle these exceptions. Yeah, this place. We went through this exception class hierarchy, right? I want to make a few changes to my statements here. I told you that we have some members of throwable class. Get detailed message. So that is one data member. And I also talked to you about this member cause. And we talked about the methods. What are the methods we have used? Get message. This is one method. And get cause is another method. And print stack trace. These are the methods of throwable class. There are other methods too. We have looked at only these methods. I told you that this exception class inherits everything, right? Because it's an ISA relationship. This is not going to inherit these two data members because they are actually private data members. So these are private data members of the throwable class. Only the methods, whatever methods we have, these methods are public. So all these methods are getting inherited. So inheritance happens only with the methods. If you want to initialize this detailed message, what you have to do is you have to pass the, it's a parameterized constructor in your throwable class which will initialize your detailed message. So you have to pass that value from your subclass. So how you pass the value? We do this, right? We just do super and then we pass that string. So this string from your subclass will be used for running your parameterized constructor in the throwable class and initializing the detailed message. In all the data members are not public, there are private data members. So you can go and very well verify that too. Let's have a verification on that. So if I just have this throwable alone, let me open this declaration. Okay, it's already opened here. So if you just go to the top, you can see this cause is actually not a string, it's of type throwable. Cause itself is an object of type throwable, and you have this detailed message, right? Detailed message is again a private string in throwable. So if you want to initialize detailed message, you have to use the constructor. So where is this detailed message getting initialized? Let's go and check that. There a place. So this string get message. So when you are calling get message, it returns detailed message that we are initializing. So, yeah, detailed message is equal to message. So that's what we have to pass our value to the parameterized constructor in our base class. Very important. No, this one I was wrong while I was teaching the last class. I didn't take a look at this private data member anyway. So that correction alone we'll have. And what we are going to learn today is user-defined exceptions. Inheritance between user-defined exceptions in Java. How will you create a user-defined exception? For instance, Satish exception is my own class. This class actually has two classes extending it. One is number 13 exception. Number 13 exception is, say I don't like number 13 coming in as input. So this extends Satish exception and then it throws a message whenever 13 comes in as an input. Likewise, there is a number 15 exception. So these are my two of my own exception classes, which is extending my user defined exception class. So I'm going to implement this. So there is an inheritance. So my own exception class inheriting another exception which I have defined. So you can have inheritance and user defined exceptions like what you had for your standard exceptions. Okay, so let's go and try and execute this. So we'll have, are you able to see this screen? Let me close this one out. So let's have this class Satish exception. It's going to extends exception. Say it's very important that whatever exception class you're going to write, it always extends the exception uh, class. See, you can also extend arithmetic exception or runtime exception directly here, but your exception should be a variation of the runtime exception, or else there is no point in extending it. A professor is a faculty. You extend a professor because only he is a faculty, right? Likewise, when you extend an arithmetic exception, your exception should be an arithmetic exception. So here, all exceptions extend exception class. So how will you pass the message and initialize the detailed message? You will have a constructor here. Let me just give a constructor here. This constructor is going to get in, what it's going to get in? A string. So it's going to get in a string. And then I'm going to pass this string to my base class parameterized constructor. That is the throwable class. So I'm going to perform that here. And there is number 13 exception extending Satish exception. How will you create inheritance here? Class number 13 exception extends, you have a Satish exception, right? So, and we are going to have some message for number 13 exception too. So we'll have a constructor here. So constructor for this, and we'll delete this. We'll pass this whatever that is string that is coming in to our base class. Okay. Likewise, you also have a number 15 exception extending our Satish exception. So class number 15 exception extends, and you have a constructor here. So in this constructor, you are going to use the super method and pass the string. Okay. Here, what you are going to do, get the string as the input. Okay. So we have implemented a series of exception classes here. Okay. Now what we'll do is we'll get the input, we'll try and throw these exceptions and handle it. Okay. All are user defined exceptions. So what we'll do is we'll get an input from the user. For that we'll have a sysout statement saying enter input, enter a number. So what we'll do here is we'll have a scanner actually. This scanner okay, and then we'll get this input number from input.nextInt. We'll get an integer value, and then we'll check if number equals 13. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the throw keyword and then throw an exception, that is number 13 exception, and then we'll pass this yes. What is this yes? Say it can be I don't like 13. Okay. If num is equal to 15, again we have to throw a new exception, right? Throw new. What is this exception? It's a number 15 exception we'll be throwing, and then we'll say number 15 not allowed, something like this. Okay, so we are throwing two exceptions here. Only thing is we have to handle them using catch blocks. How will you handle them using catch blocks? Very simple. You just first, before even having a catch, you should have a try. Let me directly give a catch here. What I'm going to handle, I'm going to get an object of type number 13 getting coming here, and then I'll do sysout. I'll just print e dot get message. Okay. Likewise, I'll catch a number 15 exception that's coming here. Say it's m, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to print that appropriate message. That is m dot get message. Fine. See, we are getting an error here. When you take a look at this code, you're getting an error. What is this error? Catch without a try. So it's mandatory you have a try. So you put everything inside the try. Wherever that exceptions will arise, you put that, enclose that within a try, you define the boundary, or else you'll get an error. So this entire block of code is within a try. Okay. So now the errors are gone. What we'll do is we'll execute this program, check whether we are getting the output. Yeah. Let's run this one. There's an error somewhere. This one. Yeah. Is that error? Okay. Enter a number. If I enter 13, what's going to happen? It's going to throw an exception object. So I don't like 13. This particular thing is handled here. If I execute and give 15, what's going to happen? If I execute and give 15, it's going to throw 15. If I give number 15 is not allowed. So one thing we understand, right? If this exception is thrown, this is handled here. If this exception is thrown, this is handled here. See, that's all about user-defined exceptions and inheritance between user-defined exceptions. We are going to learn one more rule with user-defined exceptions. That is, a child class exception can be handled by a base class. A child class exception can be handled in a base class catch statement. I'll give you an example here. Say, what are the child classes here? Child classes are number 13 and number 15. Base classes Satish exception. So whenever a number 13 exception is thrown, I can very well catch it using the base class Satish exception. It is allowed. So what I will do is, you go to the same code here. Let me remove all this catch. What I can do here is, I can just give the base class handler here, that is Satish exception E, and then whenever an exception gets thrown, I'm going to catch it here, and then I will say let me have a sysout statement, and then I can put E dot get message. So this is allowed. A base class can catch any of the child class objects that are getting thrown. So here what happens is, let me go and execute this. Let's check. If I'm going to execute 13, enter 13, it's going to throw me number 13 exception. It is being caught by this handler and it is getting thrown. I don't like 13. If I execute the 15, so if I execute 15, so now the base class handler handles all the exceptions of the type child class that's getting thrown here. Satish exception extends what class? Satish exception extends exception. So you can just give even exception here. Even that is allowed. So you can just give exception. It will still work the same way as it did, because this is the base class for your Satish exception, right? So you can very well do that. So if I enter a number 13, so when you use the classes up the hierarchy, it will still catch all the exceptions of your child class. The only thing here is, say if an arithmetic exception happens, I want to do a certain set of steps for arithmetic exception. If a runtime input mismatch happens, I want to perform a certain set of statements for input mismatch. How can I go and define that when I have a common catch block like this? There is a way to define that. For instance, say I want to print the message, I also want to print my own custom message when an say a number 13 or a number 15 occurs. Say for number 13, I want to print another message inside this exception class, like please don't enter 13 again. If number 15 occurs, I should print this and also print another message like please don't enter number 15 again. So here we are having some specific messages for certain type of exceptions getting thrown, right? So what we can do is, we can very well perform that here. I can go and check if the exception thrown is an instance of number 13. So if that object is an instance of this class, then I can very well go and perform a very specific sysout statement here. Please don't enter number 13. Okay. Likewise, if E is an instance of number 15 exception, what we can do is we can throw a very specific message for number 15 exception alone. That is 15 is not allowed, something like that. So you can display e.get message and also your specific message for that exception or any steps that you want to do when that exception occurs. How will you check that? You can use instance of and check it. Now let's go and execute this. Let's go and execute this. Control F11. So you will see if I enter 13, please don't enter 13. That is nothing but this particular message. So it knows it is an instance of this. If I enter 15, it's going to print this. We'll proceed further. There are other questions here. I can ask other questions. Say, let me remove all these instance checks. Let me have a very simple sysout statement here. So I am catching Satish exception. Let's go with Satish exception here. This is the base class, right? And then let me print I am Satish exception. So now, what happens if I have catch number 13 exception here? I have both these things. Catch number 13 exception M, and then I do sysout. What I'm going to print is m.get message. I have the base class exception handler. I also have the child class exception handler here. Now will this be fine? Which one is going to handle it? If I throw a number 13 exception, will this one catch it or this one catch it? First one that comes in the hierarchy actually does the job for us. So let us go and print this one. Say, if I just invoke number 13 exception, what's happening? I don't like 13. That is nothing bad. That was handled here. M.get message. So we didn't even go to this particular exception. So you can also have the child class and the base class, but whichever child class that comes in the beginning will be handling that exception. Another thing that we have to watch out for is, what if we have something like this? See, after the base class, I have my child class exception. Now, what's going to happen? So in Eclipse, we are getting an error. Error in the sense, it gives me an error saying, number 13 exception is unreachable block of code. Because everything that comes in will be handled by Satish exception. There's no way you're going to bypass this and go to this child class. So it really throws me an error. If I go and run this, you see, I have to save this. Let me save this. Let me try running this. It throws me an error. It's not even allowing that. So you should see to that your base class comes next and your child class comes first. It depends on you, but if you're going to put things like this, you'll get an error. So these are some of the common questions I got in the lab. Is that clear? So now let us talk about throws class. Throws class, what is the use of this? Say we went through some important keywords, right? What are those keywords we learned? 3 keywords we have already learned. Try we know. Boundary of your exception. Throw is for throwing an exception. We have used it many times. Catch is for handling the exception. Throws. What is the use of throws? Used as a method signature. Indicates that there might be an exception in the method. So it's just for a method prototype. Say when I look at the method, I can know that this method might throw an exception of this sum. So let me go and give you an example. So here, throws class specifies exceptions that a method throws. For instance, if I have a method divide numbers int a, int b, I will use this keyword throws and then I say arithmetic exception. So when I take a look at this method declaration, I know that an arithmetic exception might be thrown from this method. So a method can also throw multiple exceptions, say input mismatch, arithmetic exception. So what you can do is you can put all the list of exceptions with a comma. So when I use this method, I should be very cautious about handling arithmetic exceptions and any user defined exceptions or anything. So why we need this throws? It's just a signature that's saying, okay, you're going to use me. Now you handle whatever exceptions I may throw. Okay. So let us take an exercise here. You have a class by name divide by 0. You have two variables, int a and int b, private variables. You have a constructor, initialize some values to a and b. Finally, you have this method divide two numbers and you divide and throw the result. You perform that inside a class, whereas your divide two numbers should have a signature like this. Can you take that example now? Can you try that? Divide by 0 has two variables. You initialize them in the constructor, call the method, divide and throw the result. You're going to throw, you're going to have the signature like throws arithmetic exception. You're going to have the signature. Let's go and execute this. Very simple piece of code. Let me delete everything here. Let's go and execute this. So class divide by 0, right? We'll have this class. We'll have two data members, private int A and private int B. And then what we'll do is we'll have a constructor to initialize. So this constructor, what it's going to do is, let's have some default values. A is equal to 10 and B is equal to 5. And then what we'll do is we'll have this method divide by 0, right? Divide numbers. So let's have this public method. And what is that method? Divide numbers. See, after the close of the parenthesis, you have to give the keyword throws arithmetic exception. See, even when you don't give throws, it's anyway going to throw an arithmetic exception. Why we give this is a method should tell, a definition of the method should say what that method can do to your code. This signature gives me an alert, okay, I should handle that. So we'll see this here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just throw it out. This out and then I'll just throw A by B. Okay. So what we'll do now is we'll go and create an object of type divide by 0. So we can just go and create an object here. So it's divide by 0, right? Okay, D. And how will you call this method? D dot divide numbers. Fine. So this is how you create it. Now let's go and execute it. Two. Because divide numbers throws me the result. Now the question is, how can I raise an exception? For instance, if I initialize B to 0, what will happen? This will try to divide by 0, an exception will happen in this method. So what we'll do is we'll go and raise an exception here. Let's go and execute this again. So let's do this. See, exception in thread main, where this occurred, divide numbers method, you have the exception occurring. You understood why? Because second number was given as 0, initialized as 0. So how can you handle this? So when I use this method, I should know what are the exceptions that it throws. So how will I handle that? When I call that method, I should enclose within a try block. Okay, this method is throwing some exceptions. Let me enclose within a try block. What exception it throws, how will I know? Okay, it throws arithmetic exception. So I should go and catch arithmetic exception. And then say, we can put a sysout statement here. This is what here. Okay, so now since I know this method is throwing it, I have to catch it. So if I go and again perform the same thing, you can see it's not terminating, but then it's performing what we are asking it to do. So this is why we use the throws class. Throws is different from throw. THROS is used in the method, whereas throw is used for throwing an exception. Yes, it's just a method signature. Say a method can throw a NoSQL exception, You can throw a file not found exception. You can throw variety of exceptions. If you have a very large method and you are a user who is trying to use that method, you will not know what kind of exceptions can happen from within that method, right? But when you know the signature, you very well know that you have to somehow handle those exceptions when you're using that method. So when you use throws, it just gives you an information. So even without throws, the same problem is going to occur. But now at least I know I am in a position to handle it, right? By just reading the signature. Okay, so another question, can constructors throw exceptions? Can an exception occur inside a constructor? Will it throw an exception? So what we'll do is, instead of getting A to 10 and B to 0, I'll get the input here and initialize it within the constructor. How can I get the input here? Say I can have a sysort statement within my constructor, and then I can ask the user to enter two numbers. And then we can have this scanner. Oh God. I can even do this. It's system dot n. And then what we'll do is we'll have A is equal to input dot next in, and then B is equal to input dot next in. So now everything is happening within the constructor, reading the input and handling it. So now what happens? Let me go and execute this code again. See, what we are trying to catch here is only an arithmetic exception that will occur when we use this method. So that's what we are doing. Let's go and run this code again. What we'll try to do now is we'll try to enter two numbers from within the constructor. I am entering, say 2 and Satish, because there is an input mismatch happening there. So constructor now is giving us the exception. While you're creating the object itself, you can get an exception. That's what I'm telling you. How to handle that? How can I handle this input mismatch occurring within my constructor? Just put this divide by 0, right? So I can just put this inside this try block. So whenever an object getting created, input mismatch exception can occur. So where can I handle it? I can handle it here. Catch. Okay. And then you can put a message. Okay. So this will read to an exception that will be handled here. So a constructor can also throw an exception. That's what is our idea here. So let me just go and run this one. So if I enter 2 and Satish, now it is not terminating. Okay. So you have a constructor like this, and see the problem here. You extend a class test extends divide by 0. So when I create an object of test, superclass constructor will run. There is a scenario wherein that when that constructor runs, an exception can be thrown. So when you create an object of your base class, no child class, this should also be inside the try block. You should also handle the exception when you create an object of your type test, because this will invoke your base class constructor and an exception can be thrown. That can occur. So you should be cautious when you're using inheritance and exceptions. Okay. So all these things we have seen. Finally, we look at one more concept, the finally block and exception handling. What is the use of finally? So finally comes with this keyword called finally, and then you enclose a block of code. What is this finally block used for? Say your program will have, you will read a file in your program. You'll open a file, read some data, you'll close the file. Or else you will open a database connection, read some data, you'll be processing some data from the database. Or you'll have a network connection, you'll be talking to a database on a network. So things will happen. So while you're reading data from a file, an exception occurs. You want to now terminate the entire process, maybe shut down the program, you have got the exception. So in that case, you have to close the file. before you are closing your program, right? So what you have to do is you have to put the releasing the resource content inside your finally block. Finally will execute either the program terminates or the program successfully completes. Because we have to close the database connections, close the files, close the network connections. Either you terminate or you successfully complete, you have to close these things so that other programs can take up these resources. So finally is something that we will see. What is this finally block? Say, I'm catching all these exceptions here. I love this finally and then a block of code. I love a sysout statement here. This sysout statement is going to say, finally I am executed. See here in this finally block, we'll have file.close, database connection.close, or any network connections you're going to close here. So this one will execute either an exception occurs or it is not going to occur. So that is the use of finally. Let's go and execute this. So first let us go and run the program without any exceptions. Let's enter 10 and 5. So 2 is the result of the division. Finally block got executed. So normal execution also will lead to execution of finally block if an exception occurs. So let's go and execute it again. So if I give 10 and Satish, there's an exception. So input mismatch exception will be handled. But then you see the input mismatch exception was handled, but then the finally block executed. So finally, when your code terminates or when it executes successfully, this block should execute. That is the use of finally. Is that clear? It is used for releasing resources. Nested exceptions. What do you mean by nested exception? Say a try catch block within another try. So this is a nested try catch. So this is a nested exception. So what is that we understand here is, say suppose an arithmetic exception gets thrown here. If you get an arithmetic exception, where it will be caught? In this catch block. If an exception occurs in the outer try, say if there is an input mismatch here, where this will be handled? This will be handled in this outer catch. So there is one small change here. Actually, you can have, it is mandatory to have a catch here. It is not so. You can also have something else. Instead of a catch, you can have a finally block after try for a nested catch. That is allowed. So what happens is, when an arithmetic exception gets thrown, your finally block will execute, and then somehow you should handle this arithmetic exception in your outer catch. You understood that? So whatever exception that arises, if it's not handled here, it should be handled in the outer blocks. So we'll finish code for this alone and then we'll wind up. It's a very important concept. So what I'll do is I'll put an outer try here, enclose everything, all these things. Okay, maybe divide by 0. Let me just put. So we have an inner try. And then I'm not going to have a catch block after the inner try. I'll have a finally block here. Finally, I will say sysout. Finally from the inner try. Finally from inner try. Okay. Then in the outer catch, I'm going to catch this arithmetic exception in. Okay. Let me remove the remaining part of the code. So if an arithmetic exception occurs here, it will go and execute the finally, then it search for an handler outside the block. If there is an handler, it will be handled here, or else it will terminate. So let's go and run this one out now. Let's check. So if I enter two numbers, say if I enter 5 and 0, an arithmetic exception happens. You see here finally from inner. So what happens is, once when an arithmetic exception happens, this finally code executes. Next, it searches for a corresponding handler in the outer loop. This is there, so it handles that arithmetic exception. Suppose if there is no corresponding handler in the outer block, what will happen? That will be your last execution. Say if I have an input mismatch, if I have 5 and if I enter Satish, so this will throw an input mismatch, finally will execute, but then there is no handler here, so it will terminate. Let's go and execute this one. 5 and Satish. But finally block executes before it terminates because there is no handler in the outer catch. So an inner try is not having corresponding catch, it will search for a catch in the outer blocks. Okay, fine. That's it.